The air hung thick with the smell of rust and damp earth. Towers of twisted metal and broken machinery rose around him, cast in the dim, gray light filtering through clouds of dust. The human mechanical man paused, wiping oil-stained fingers on his coveralls. His boots left faint impressions in the layers of grit as he moved with the practiced gait of someone who'd worked among the remains of forgotten machines for years. This place, the junkyard, had been his home, his workshop, his refuge. Everywhere he looked, there were fragments of what used to be, scraps of alien technology, the occasional piece of military hardware, and mechanical parts whose purposes had been long forgotten. The junkyard had become a repository for the aftermath of interstellar battles, a graveyard for machinery too battered to be of any further use. But the human mechanical man saw opportunity here, a chance to salvage, to repair, to rebuild. As he sifted through the twisted remains of a cargo container, his eyes caught a glint beneath a pile of scrap. Curious, he brushed aside layers of debris to reveal something unlike anything he'd seen. There, tangled in broken circuits and crumpled metal, was what looked like a body, an alien body. Its form was unmistakably feminine but entirely mechanical, with intricate armor plating that covered a frame unlike anything built by human hands. He hesitated, a feeling he wasn't used to creeping into his mind. There was something dignified about this figure, even in its disassembled state. Closer inspection revealed she was beyond the usual level of damage he encountered in salvaged parts. Cracks webbed across her armored limbs, wires were exposed, and her faceplate bore scars from what could only have been intense combat. A slight hum emitted from a faintly glowing core near her chest, weak but still present. Whoever she was, wherever she had come from, she had been built to withstand an immense amount of punishment. And judging by the state of her components, she'd taken more than her fair share of it. He knelt beside the battered remains, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The core in her chest, if it could even be called a heart, was still functional, barely. He could just make out the faded glow pulsating within. It was as if this machine, this alien cyborg, was holding on to the last shreds of life left in her circuits. He couldn't explain why, but he felt compelled to help, to try and restore whatever was left of her. He rolled up his sleeves, reaching for his toolkit. It wasn't that he hadn't found cyborgs before in this junkyard. He'd found plenty of spare parts from humanoid machines, bits and pieces from all sorts of synthetic creatures, both human and alien. But this was different. She was almost complete, unlike the usual fragmented pieces. The design of her limbs, the seamless integration of organic and mechanical elements, the advanced material, there was a sophistication here he'd never seen before. This was a soldier, a warrior of the highest caliber, yet one reduced to this state. He worked methodically, carefully disassembling some of the twisted metal surrounding her to get a better look. Each movement was precise, and each tool chosen deliberately. He started with her legs, where he could see multiple joints were dislodged. He tightened bolts, adjusted the hydraulics, and reconnected a web of wires that had been frayed beyond recognition. He inspected her joints and saw how they allowed for agility and strength in ways he never even imagined, and each repaired connection revealed more about her capabilities. Whoever had built her had understood combat, engineering, and artistry. After hours of silent work, he paused, standing back to survey his progress. She was still motionless, yet there was a sense of potential there now, a hint that, given the right amount of time and attention, she might be more than just another salvaged machine. He could see the weariness in his hands, the ache in his fingers, but something deeper than fatigue kept him going. It occurred to him then, as he continued piecing her together, that he was breathing life back into something not meant to be discarded. And maybe, just maybe, he was doing it not only for her but for himself. This wasn't the first time he tried to put something broken back together. There had been others, friends, partners, lost in the wreckage of the same wars that had left these machines here. Yet, unlike them, this cyborg had survived in some sense, her core still pulsing faintly. He remembered someone once telling him that machines could not feel loss, could not understand pain. But looking at her now, battered and broken, he found himself doubting that. Her body was a testament to resilience, a monument to someone who'd fought and endured. She wasn't just a weapon, she was someone, or something, who had been alive in the only way machines knew how. With a sigh, he began working on her faceplate, carefully smoothing over the cracks and aligning the sensors. There was an elegance to her design that went beyond mere function. As he connected the sensors in her eyes, he wondered if she'd recognize her reflection, if she'd remember the face that had once gazed back from beneath the surface of her visor. As dawn began to break over the junkyard, casting a dim, orange glow across the piles of discarded machinery, he made one last connection. Her chest core flickered, sputtering briefly before settling into a steady, albeit faint, pulse. Her eyes glowed, a deep and haunting light, casting shadows across her face. She was still, and he knew she wasn't fully awake yet. But he could see the difference, see the potential waiting to be unlocked. He felt a quiet satisfaction, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond he'd formed with this creation, this stranger from a distant place. The junkyard was silent, save for the hum of her core, a sound that, against the stillness, seemed almost like a heartbeat. It was a fragile sound, and he knew he'd have to work harder to ensure it grew stronger. As he packed up his tools, he looked down at her one last time, feeling a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know if she'd ever fully awaken or if he'd truly restored her to what she once was. But that faint, pulsing light was enough to convince him it was worth trying. Tomorrow, he'd start again, diving deeper into the mechanics of her body, reconnecting the delicate wiring, decoding the strange, alien scripts embedded in her processors. He'd spend hours hunched over her frame, wrestling with technology far beyond his understanding. And maybe, just maybe, she'd begin to remember herself. The human mechanical man lingered for a moment longer, letting the silence fill him with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know if she'd ever speak or recognize the life he'd painstakingly tried to salvage. But he was prepared to keep trying, as long as it took. He turned away from the broken alien cyborg, ready to face another day in the junkyard, where life was only ever a heartbeat away from extinction. His hands moved over the alien cyborg's form with a mechanic's precision, eyes narrowed as he examined each joint, each wire. Some of the inner mechanisms were foreign to him, advanced beyond anything human technology had achieved, but he wasn't the type to shy away from a challenge. Piece by piece, he began rebuilding her framework, starting from the legs. He replaced missing bolts, tightened loose connections, and with a mix of hope and pragmatism, began to fuse her body back together. Each movement was methodical, calculated. Some parts seemed familiar, similar to Earth technology in principle if not in design, but others were a mystery, built with alien alloys and unusual wiring schemes. When he found a severed line, he spliced it as best as he could, using spare wiring from a pile of salvaged electronics nearby. Every few minutes he would stand back, watching for any reaction, any flicker of light or sign of movement. So far, there was nothing beyond the weak hum of her core, but he wasn't discouraged. This was a process, one that required patience and grit. As he worked, he noticed something odd about the wiring. Some circuits seemed to be designed with a feedback loop, a system that suggested some level of adaptability. It reminded him of tech he'd only heard about in theory, systems that could respond to environmental changes on their own. The cyborg's design spoke to a level of engineering that made Earth's advancements look primitive by comparison. He wondered what kind of society had created her, who had built a machine with this kind of resilience. Every inch of her body, even in its damaged state, told a story of war and survival. Halfway through his repairs, he hit a snag. A piece of wiring that led to her core was so severely damaged that nothing he had would work as a replacement. He frowned, searching through the parts he'd collected over the years, hoping he'd find something suitable. After a few frustrating moments, he spotted an old military power conduit from an Earth-based defense system, rare, powerful, and maybe just what he needed. He cut it down to size, carefully grafting it to her damaged circuits. The connection was tenuous, but with a few modifications it held. When he tested it, her core flickered a little brighter, as though a small surge of energy had made it through. Her arm was next, twisted and nearly unrecognizable beneath the surface dents and scratches. The damage was extensive, suggesting it had taken the brunt of some kind of impact, likely in battle. Carefully, he began reshaping it, smoothing out dents, replacing broken sections with new alloys he'd scavenged, and recalibrating the complex wiring within. It was intricate work, but he could see her coming back together, piece by piece. There was something strangely fulfilling in each successful repair, each connection that clicked into place. Working on her head and faceplate was a different experience. He handled this part of her frame more delicately, as though respecting her identity, whoever or whatever that might have been. Inside the faceplate, he found an advanced processor core, encased in layers of protective material. This was the most intricate piece he'd encountered yet, full of alien codes and systems that were incomprehensible to him. He could only hope that whatever he was doing didn't disrupt something critical, and he was aware that one wrong move could erase any memory she might still retain. His frustration grew as he tried to connect her facial sensors. The circuits were encrypted in alien code, and without the right interface, he couldn't fully decipher them. Yet, every time he connected a piece of wiring, he saw a small spark, a flicker of something deeper within her, a life or memory, perhaps, struggling to surface. It was as though the machine wanted to live again, but some barrier was keeping her from waking up. He wondered if it was an intentional defense mechanism, a failsafe in case she fell into the wrong hands. Or maybe it was just the remnants of old programming, clinging to its last shreds of control. As the hours passed, the work became increasingly taxing. Each time he thought he was finished, he found another damaged section, another piece that needed fine-tuning. His fingers ached, his eyes strained against the dim light, and yet he continued, undeterred. There was a drive within him that went beyond just curiosity. Maybe it was his own form of rebellion, against a world that discarded things that no longer had a use, that treated both people and machines as expendable. By reviving her, he felt as if he were giving a second chance, both to her and to himself. Finally, he reached her core, the beating heart of her mechanical form. It was alien in every way, yet it pulsed with a familiar rhythm. He'd done his best to clean and repair it, but he knew he'd never be able to fully restore it to its original state. The cyborg would have to live with imperfections, with parts that didn't quite fit, with power that might wane more quickly than it should. Still, it was better than oblivion. He'd restored enough of the circuits to give her a fighting chance at a second life. With one last connection, he closed her chest plate, sealing the core within its protective shell. He could see her power stabilizing, her core brightening with renewed energy. He didn't know if it was enough, if she would truly wake, but he had done everything he could. As he stepped back, waiting for some sign, he felt the weight of his exhaustion, but also a sense of accomplishment. This machine, this alien being, was no longer just a pile of scrap. She was something more now, alive, or at least as close to it as she could be. There was a long silence as he stood there, waiting. And then, slowly, her eyes lit up, a soft glow emanating from beneath her faceplate. She didn't move, didn't speak, but there was an awareness there, a recognition. He watched as she scanned her surroundings, the hum of her core growing slightly louder, steadier. She was processing, reconnecting with herself in some way. He saw her arm twitch, her fingers slowly curling and then relaxing. It was a small movement, but it was enough to show him that she was, in some capacity, aware. She turned her head, her eyes focusing on him. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something, confusion, maybe curiosity. Her gaze was intense, and he could feel the weight of her scrutiny, as though she were assessing him, trying to understand who he was and why he had brought her back. He felt a pang of uncertainty. He didn't know if she viewed him as an ally, a threat, or something in between. But there was no going back now. They were both here, in this moment, bound by the act of revival. Her systems buzzed, small glitches making her body tremble as she recalibrated, adapting to the repairs he'd made. He could tell that not everything was working perfectly. There were still malfunctions, irregularities that he couldn't fix, but it was enough for her to start. Enough for her to begin piecing together who she was, or at least who she used to be. He reached out, almost instinctively, as if to offer reassurance. It's okay, he murmured softly. You're safe here. He didn't know if she understood his words, but he hoped his tone would convey his intentions. She continued to look at him, silent, her gaze unbroken. It was as if she was searching for something, some sign that he was trustworthy, that she could rely on him. Finally, her head inclined ever so slightly, a subtle acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He knew that he'd managed to reach her, if only a little. She stared at him, her gaze sharp and calculating, a faint, hollow glow illuminating her eyes. She was still recalibrating, movements halting, unsure. He remained still, hands open, trying not to startle her. Every part he restored seemed to be waking up, system by system, but her expression was a mixture of confusion and something else, something haunted. In the silence, her head jerked to the side, as if some deep-seated protocol had activated, her mechanical limbs tightening, preparing for a threat that only she could see. Her eyes began to flicker, faster now, and he could sense the memories flooding back, activating her programming in a fragmented, disjointed way. The hum of her core rose in pitch, her processors whirring as she struggled to reconcile where she was. A few unintelligible sounds escaped her, static-laden, distorted, fragments of language he didn't understand. He watched as her gaze shifted, seeing things he couldn't. Her chest heaved, her arms tensed as if she were trapped in a flashback, and he felt the chill of something intensely real, yet entirely out of his grasp. Then, without warning, she reacted. Her arm shot out, grabbing a metal rod from the ground, eyes scanning the area, her stance rigid and defensive. He instinctively took a step back, hands up, speaking softly. Hey! It's all right. You're safe here. There's no one else around. Her focus slowly returned to him, her gaze unyielding but vacant, like she was seeing him through a fog. She tilted her head, processing his words. For a moment, her grip on the rod loosened, as if she'd begun to recognize that he wasn't a threat. Her body relaxed, but then her head jerked sharply, and he realized she was still locked in some kind of mental struggle, caught between her programming and whatever fragments of memory had survived within her. She began to speak, her voice monotone, broken into sharp, calculated sentences. Combat unit primary objective, protect. Her eyes lost focus again as her mind seemed to trail off into memories that weren't coherent, not fully accessible. He listened, recognizing a familiar strain in her tone, a kind of resignation he'd seen before, the kind that comes after long stretches of solitude and survival. It was as if she were trapped between her identity as a weapon and whatever fragments of personhood she might still have left. He watched as her gaze softened, the tension in her body dissolving into a kind of fatigue. She looked down at her hands, flexing her metal fingers, seeming almost to question her own existence. The reflection of her faintly glowing eyes in her metallic palms seemed to hold her attention, like she was contemplating what she was, who she was, and why she was here. Where am I? She asked, her voice clearer though still laced with a strange mechanical echo. She looked at him, awaiting an answer with an intensity that seemed almost human. You're in a junkyard, he replied, keeping his tone calm. I found you here, broken, and I did what I could to repair you. Do you remember anything? The question seemed to trigger something in her. Her eyes flared briefly, her head lowering as if weighed down by something immense. I was in battle. Fighting, they were advancing everywhere. We couldn't hold the line. Her voice broke, as though her systems were struggling to relay the memories in any coherent way. She placed a hand to her head, wincing as flashes of images came rushing back. I was left behind. My unit, they didn't survive. He could see the toll her memories were taking on her, the way her shoulders slumped as though the weight of her past battles was pressing down on her even now. He recognized the look, he'd seen it in himself in moments of solitude, those fragments of his own life that he tried not to think about too deeply. But here she was, reliving her purpose, her abandonment, her failure to protect. It was a memory loop that seemed to be encoded in her core. I was built to protect, she continued, her voice now softer, tinged with an undercurrent of something that almost resembled sorrow. A soldier. I fought in the front lines, saw cities crumble, lives taken. She trailed off, her gaze falling to the ground, as though the memories were too heavy to bear. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to keep carrying that weight, that here in the junkyard, those battles didn't matter anymore. But he knew better. This wasn't something he could fix with tools and wiring. This was something deeper, something that had been woven into her very being. Her memories were as much a part of her as the metal that encased her frame, as much a part of her as the circuitry he'd reconnected. After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice hollow. I don't know why you fixed me. I am a weapon, a tool designed to destroy. Why would anyone want me back in one piece? He looked at her, her mechanical form silhouetted against the towering piles of junk, her course still flickering faintly. He thought about the wars he'd survived, the people he'd lost, and the purpose he'd felt slipping away over time. Maybe I didn't want you to stay that way, he said simply. You've been through hell. I figured you deserved another shot, even if it's just to find some peace. She tilted her head, as if trying to understand his reasoning. The idea of peace seemed foreign to her, as though it was a concept that had been stripped from her programming. But something in his words resonated with her, and for the first time, her posture relaxed entirely, her eyes dimming slightly, as though she were processing emotions she couldn't quite identify. I don't know if I can find peace, she said softly, almost to herself. I was not built for that. But thank you. Her gaze turned to him, and there was a flicker of something almost like gratitude in her eyes. For giving me a chance. They stayed in silence for a while, and he could see her trying to make sense of herself, to figure out where she fit into this new, quiet existence. She seemed almost out of place here, her armored body in stark contrast to the stillness around her. But he knew that she, like him, was searching for something, a purpose beyond the battlefield. She was no longer just a weapon, no longer just another piece of machinery left to rust. He had given her a new start, and perhaps that was all anyone could ask for. Finally, she looked at him, a subtle strength in her gaze. I am not certain of my purpose now, but I wish to find it. To learn what else I might be. He nodded, sensing the resolve in her tone. You're more than what you were made for. Out here, you get to decide who you want to be. He didn't know if his words would mean much, but he hoped they offered her some kind of comfort, some glimmer of possibility. She turned her gaze to the horizon, her eyes steady, her stance firm. For the first time, he saw in her a sense of agency, a readiness to step into whatever came next, no longer bound solely to the remnants of her past. She would still carry the scars of her battles, still feel the echoes of those memories, but now, she had the freedom to create new ones. They stood side by side in the quiet of the junkyard, the stillness interrupted only by the faint hum of her core and the soft rustling of debris around them. Her gaze scanned the landscape, eyes sharp, taking in the endless piles of scrap and remnants of machines long discarded. For the first time, her stance was relaxed, less guarded, as if she'd finally accepted this new world around her, even if she didn't yet understand it. She'd come from a place of purpose and violence, designed for battle and nothing more, but now, out here, that single-minded directive had faded, replaced by a tentative curiosity. Her voice broke the silence, low and thoughtful. I can still feel them, the memories of combat, the protocols. They are faded, but they linger. She raised a hand, studying her own metal-plated fingers as though she could read her past in the etchings and scars covering them. I am built to defend, to eliminate threats. But there is no battlefield here. No enemy. Her hand dropped to her side, the faint light in her eyes flickering uncertainly. There's no battlefield here, no, he said, watching her closely. But that doesn't mean you don't have a purpose. He gestured toward the horizon, the endless open world that lay beyond the junkyard's boundaries. Out there, maybe you can decide what you want to be. Her gaze followed his hand, and something akin to resolve flashed in her eyes. Perhaps I could protect others. I still remember how to fight, how to defend. Maybe I can be something different. Her voice grew more certain, each word sounding less like a programmed response and more like an emerging sense of self. She looked at him again, her expression questioning. Would that make me more than just a weapon? He nodded, his face set in quiet agreement. It's not about what you were made to be. It's about what you choose to become. The simplicity of the words seemed to resonate with her, as though they unlocked something deep within her circuits, a sense of direction she hadn't known she needed. They stood there in silence for a while, and he could almost feel her processing, assessing the possibilities ahead. And as they lingered, a low rumble broke the silence. Across the far end of the junkyard, a faint but unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps echoed, slow but deliberate. They both turned, and he recognized the telltale glint of makeshift armor and rough, scavenged weapons in the hands of a small group of raiders. Junkyard scroungers, opportunistic and armed, ready to claim whatever they could find. The cyborg's body tensed instinctively, slipping into a stance of readiness, her eyes narrowing as she sized up the intruders. He could see the warrior within her reawakening, a flicker of old programming blending with her newfound self-awareness. But this time, her purpose wasn't just about fighting for the sake of it. There was intention, focus, something she'd chosen rather than something she was compelled to do. The raiders halted as they spotted the two of them, their eyes taking in the strange sight of the human mechanical man standing alongside the towering, armored cyborg. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his face, stepped forward, pointing a crude weapon in their direction. "This is our ground now," he barked, his voice filled with the rough bravado of someone who never met true resistance. The human mechanical man met the raider's stare calmly, feeling a quiet confidence with the cyborg at his side. But before he could respond, she stepped forward, her movements fluid and controlled. The raider's eyes widened slightly as she spoke, her tone unwavering. "This place is no longer yours to take. Leave now, or face consequences." There was no threat in her voice, just a calm certainty that left no room for doubt. The raiders exchanged uneasy glances, the bravado slipping as they recognized the resolve in her stance. The scarred man scowled, his fingers tightening on his weapon. "You think a pile of rust like you scares us?" He took a step forward, a sneer forming on his lips. In an instant she was upon him, moving faster than his eyes could track. She disarmed him with a single fluid motion, her hand knocking the weapon from his grasp with enough force to send it clattering to the ground. He staggered back, shock evident on his face, and for a moment, a deadly silence hung between them. She didn't press further, simply stood there, her stance strong and unyielding, as though her presence alone would be enough to deter any further hostility. The rest of the raiders hesitated, uncertainty flickering across their faces. They looked at each other, weighing their options, and after a tense pause, they slowly began to back away, casting wary glances in her direction. The human mechanical man watched as they retreated, disappearing into the haze of the junkyard's edge, their footsteps fading into silence. When they were gone, she relaxed, the sharp intensity in her posture dissolving. She turned to him, her expression questioning, as though seeking his reaction to what had just transpired. "I did not harm them," she said, almost as if confirming it to herself. "But I protected this place. Is that right?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You made a choice. You defended without destroying. That's more than just following programming." He could see the understanding dawning in her eyes, the awareness that she had acted not out of compulsion but out of a decision she had consciously made. She had chosen restraint, and that choice seemed to settle something within her, an answer to the questions she'd been carrying since she'd awakened. For a long moment they stood there in silence, a quiet understanding passing between them. She looked toward the open horizon again, her expression contemplative. "There is more I could do, more I want to understand. Out there," she said, nodding toward the endless expanse beyond the junkyard. "If there are others who need protection, perhaps that is where I can find purpose." He followed her gaze, feeling a mixture of pride and a strange, bittersweet sense of loss. He knew what this meant. She was ready to leave, to step into the world and find her own path. But he also knew it was inevitable. She was more than a machine, she was becoming someone, someone who needed to find her place in a world that was no longer defined by war and destruction. With a final nod, she turned to him, her eyes reflecting a newfound resolve. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, carrying a depth of sincerity he hadn't expected. "For giving me this chance? For helping me find myself." He met her gaze, his own expression filled with a quiet warmth. "It was worth it. Take care of yourself out there." He hesitated, then added, "And remember, you're not alone. You'll find others, people who need someone like you." She nodded, a small but certain smile forming on her lips, a glimpse of the person she was becoming. With that, she turned, her steps carrying her toward the horizon. He watched as she moved away, her figure silhouetted against the dawning light, her form blending into the vast landscape beyond the junkyard.